And I welcome Sophia to moderate the morning.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so welcome to the first session. And today, Samuel Segun is going to kick us off. Samuel Segun is a senior researcher at the African Observatory on Responsible AI. His research focuses on algorithmic audit, responsible AI, technology policy, data, and computational ethics. He is the AI innovation and technology consultant for the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, Center for AI and Robotics, where he champions the development of a toolkit for responsible AI innovation in law enforcement. He has published articles and books in globally competitive venues on the philosophy of psychology, ethics of AI, and computational ethics. Outside academia, Dr. Segun works as a senior product manager, leading the development of AI and machine learning products. Today, Samuel Segun will share his insights on values at risk, constructing an Afro-ethical framework for artificial intelligence system. Thank you, Samuel Segun, for being here today, and the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. Good morning. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. An introduction has been done, and I'll be trying to explore the topic of values at risk. So I make a few assumptions here, and you'd have to pardon me. One of the assumptions that I know, or I guess some other speakers will be talking about much of what I'll be talking about, so forgive me if I kind of gloss through it, so I don't have to repeat, or I don't say some of the things they would get into more details about. So I'll just give like a general overview of what I consider to be a version of African ethics. There are several versions of African ethics, of course. One of the disclaimers also I'd like to give is that Africa is not homogeneous in terms of both its ideas and culture. So there are various flavors of the same thing. So I'll touch briefly on that. I also make some assumptions around some Western ideas, okay? Clearly I'm not Western, so you pardon me there. And I'm not a Kantian, so I'll make reference to Kant and some of his work. And I'll do that at a very superficial level, so you have an idea of the gist of the debate, not necessarily spending time to like deconstruct Kant's idea and how it applies to AI. The other point I would like to make here is I would take a not so philosophical approach in explaining this. So much of my background the last 5 years have actually been in industry. So I'm still trying to bring some part of the philosophy that I studied into my presentation. So in case it doesn't sound very philosophical to you, you pardon me for that, okay? So let's just get right to it. An introduction has been done on what I do. So much of my research currently is on algorithmic audits. So basically we try to create the metrics to be able to appraise AI systems. I did that with the United Nations Crime and Justice Research Institute, where we worked with Interpol to build guidelines for responsible AI. And arguably one of the biggest projects that has been done around AI in law enforcement. So they currently, I think 195 countries around Interpol or members of Interpol countries are going to be exploring some of the principles we set out, including readiness assessment, risk assessments, to several use cases on AI. Okay, a quick one. I'll just give you an idea of what I understand to be African ethics. So basically, these are ethical systems that are thought to be salient in sub-Saharan Africa. So my focus here is on sub-Saharan Africa, largely because the way African ethics is usually conceived is usually broken down across regions. So there's a francophone understanding of what African ethics is that is slightly different from what English-speaking or Anglophone West Africa views African ethics to be. And the same goes for North Africa, which is slightly leaning towards the concept of ethics you find in the Middle East. And what I try to do here with my definition of African ethics, I try to restrict my use of the concepts or the ideas of African ethics to what you would find in the literature, mostly English-speaking literature, mostly in Southern Africa, Eastern Africa, and some Western Africa. What's going on? Okay, yeah. So what I try to do is just to provide like a unique perspective to what we understand to be African ethics and how that applies to AI. And one of it is I consider, like, part of my assumption is that there's a lack of discussions around the ethical impact or the impact on ethics of artificial intelligence, particularly in Africa. So you find fewer literature talking about the implications for ethical values. And one of the goals here would be to try to say there are actually some implications for ethical values, and these values roll down into day-to-day lives of every African. Okay, so why does this matter? First is that AI is being rapidly integrated into various spheres of our lives. So if you're used to like playing with many of the AI tools, aside from just generative AI, practically every platform, media platform, or every technology platform is trying to incorporate one form of AI or another. You'll find that on ranging from LinkedIn to WhatsApp to practically every tool. In fact, right now, if you work in industry or you work anywhere in a research institute, a think tank or something, and you want to get funding, just tell them you're doing something on AI. You possibly get funding for that. So it's one of the easiest way, not only to secure funding, but one of the easiest way to sort of like explore new technologies, like build new things. And because this is rapidly being incorporated into everyday life, it makes it slightly difficult for people to take a step back to consider the ethical implications of these things, because there's this push for what is called first mover advantage, so the first person to get to the market with it. So this means that usually ethics is relegated to the background. Like with OpenAI was the first to sort of like democratize large language models. Even though Google had large language models earlier, Google didn't do that because there was so much fear around should the public have access to this kind of tool. And OpenAI thought that the world was ready for it and actually released it. And that set, a cascading of events since then. So because it's rapidly being incorporated into our everyday life, it's one of the reasons why this is important to talk about at this time. Second is that there's a corporate drive, okay? So I mentioned that corporations are trying to do some sort of digital transformation and incorporate AI into their systems quite rapidly. The challenge with that is that these push corporate interests almost always clashes with ethical interests. Some corporations are ethical, so disclaimer, but somehow the intrinsic capitalist drive to make profit sounds like it's in direct conflict with the ethical drive around trying to make sure that AI is used responsibly, trying to make sure that we do not have things like bias, unfairness, and the like. And thirdly, it's important to contextualize AI ethics, and not just contextualizing AI ethics, but also contextualizing the development of AI. Much of the time in the talk, I'll sort of give some examples of some people trying to contextualize AI in Africa to represent not just African values, but to also represent knowledge systems that could, not be properly captured by the AI systems built in the West. Okay, so I looked, for the sake of this talk, there's several African ethical values, but somehow they always revolve around something called Afro-communitarianism or African communitarianism. So I got the privilege to work with one of the most cited living authors on the subject that is met. He was my PhD supervisor. So we spent a lot of time exploring how this applies to African ethics and what a relational perspective would look like. And now again, another disclaimer, many communities, especially communities in the global south, actually do have some form of communitarian value systems, or what they would call collectivist cultures in sociology. So you would find that in the Middle East, you find that in Asia, where you find that even in Latin America, where some of the focus is more community-driven, family-driven. So you find much of that also in African ethics. So, but the variation you find in African ethics, what we've called, or what I've called Afro-communitarianism for the sake of this talk. The other, again, is the concept of dignity, but dignity from the African perspective, which is grounded on something we refer to as personhood built on vitality or vital force. I'll try not to get deeply into this because I believe some of the authors, other speakers will cover this. Okay, so one of the versions of, how human dignity is grounded in the normative concept of personhood is what Menketi refers to, and you'd see this in several versions. There's a version of it in Southern Africa, which is the Ubuntu strand, which almost always will have this same sort of interpretation. A person is said to have dignity if they have capacity to be part of a community, okay, or being part of a community, being either the object or the subject of communal relations with others. For this reason, we can include our cats as part of the community, our dogs as part of the community, and probably our care robots one day as part of the community, because the idea is that they could be subject of that communal relationship, and possibly object at a very limited level. Okay, so that's something, again, we have to keep in mind when we talk about community. Sometimes the discourse usually focuses on humans, like humans, have the capacity to be in community with others, or to commune with others, or to fellowship with others. But we also bear in mind that other things have the capacity to do that. That is also another debate in African ethics on AI, where the conversation, should robots have rights and all that. Okay, so I just spent some time to unpack Afro-communitarianism. Okay, in the simplest form, Afro-communitarianism tries to prioritize communal relationships and interdependence. So whereas many, I'm careful to say this, but many Euro-American societies would want to prioritize independence and actually see that as a good thing. It sounds counterintuitive to many people from collectivist cultures. So a good example would be if you say, and I've heard parents say this, that at 18 you get out of my house. That's very strange to someone from a collectivist culture. In some collectivist cultures, people actually get married, have kids, and get a house closer to their parents or to their siblings. And it also sounds strange if you're speaking to people who have come from a background where they're hyper independent. So for that reason, the prioritization of community, of family, of communion with other people, friendship, is super important. It's a crucial and central part to Afro-communitarianism as an idea and African ethics itself. Okay, also realizing selfhood through community. So that's another strand of African ethics or Afro-communitarianism. So the idea is that you become more of a person, and you see this more in the Ubuntu strand, which is the Southern African strand of it. You become more of a person the more you commune with others. The more natural way to explain that would be the more isolated a person becomes, the less likely they are to become human in that sense. So like a person is a person through other people. That's the way it's said. You become a person when you interact with other people. You hone your social skills. As you interact with people, you get better at learning how to communicate, reading social cues. The more isolated you are, the less human-like you'd become. So that's the basis of the idea that a person is a person through other people, and the goal there is to arrive at some level of self-actualization, and that self-actualization is the apex or the peak of personhood. Then what I also try to do here is to look at how this sort of like contrasts briefly with like Western individualism, because like I mentioned, Western individualism, and I'm careful to use the concept or the phrase Western individualism, but much of the literature refers to it that way. The idea of individualism here is also like a pursuit of some sense of self-actualization. The more independent you become, you're actualizing yourself, you're pushing yourself beyond boundaries and exploring your potential. Whereas it's the opposite in Afro-communitarianism, where the idea is that for you to arrive at that self-actualization, you have to do that with other people, and you have to do that in community. I'd give an example. It's not necessarily directly tied to this, but if you think about the people who give you the most candid feedback, usually people who have known you for a pretty long time. And so family, friends, they look through your emotional blackmail and just tell you what it is. So the idea is that you cannot fully become yourself if you do that alone. You would probably not get the right reflection, the right response back. So I use the word reflection carefully here, because if you think about a mirror, the role of a mirror is to sort of show you how you look, because you can't really see yourself. And that's exactly what community would do, in this case, community of family, friends, loved ones, will be a reflection of you and sort of give you the kind of feedback for you to arrive at that self-actualization. Okay, so what are some of the threats to Afro-communitarianism, like from AI? One of them is that AI systems are promoting more non-African values, or ethical values. And this is largely built on the back of recommendation systems, and recommendation systems particularly for social media. So recommendation systems now, like, it does sound like at some point, if you watch an Instagram video or something, probably like 80% of your friends will end up, they'll see that video in their timeline. Sometimes you get to see recommendations of stuff you don't even follow. And what we're beginning to see is a rise in some sort of socio-cultural and socio-political idea that represents value systems that are not necessarily localized. Okay, so you get to experience more American value system, for instance. If you live in Africa, that's much of the content that would be on your social media feed. It's one of the things we try to do an audit for. And when you get to see much of that, it's because Africa's population, the most people who have access to the internet in Africa are younger people. And so between 15 and 21, they have the most access to internet in Africa, or use it the most, and mostly for social media. What we begin to see there is that there's some sort of conflict, or sort of like a clash between values, where people begin to try to prioritize some sense of individualism and actually critique any sense of communalism. So in the sense of community drives, like, oh, you should be independent at this point, you shouldn't be independent at that point. And then there's this polarizing conflict you find on platforms. And one of the drives, or one of the key drivers we've found, has been social media. And the recommendation systems of social media has slightly prioritized videos that are produced in the West over videos produced in the majority world. The other angle to this is the addictive digital spaces and how it undermines community. Clearly, we know that when people are on their mobile phones, they kind of zone out and all focused in. And what you're beginning to see is like you could be in a gathering of people who are with their mobile phones, and they came together to have a party, and everybody's in their own world. What that does is it actually undermines the pursuit to kind of communicate with others, to interact with other people, to build community. It also hampers big social skills. So there's a research currently that shows that younger people, those who we categorize as Gen Zs, have real troubles actually reading social cues. And so they can't really tell when people are pissed and when they're not. For those who grew up in Africa, or maybe lots of collectivist society, there's a way you interact with your parents. When your mother or your dad doesn't want you to do something, they look at you in a way, and you just know what it means. Like, hey, get out of that. But many people are unable to read social cues. There are things like lots of younger people, even in Africa now, there's a spike in suicide, particularly leading in South Africa with the numbers, where I think it is 10 per 100, which is a very, very large number. There's a lot of social anxiety on the back of the addictive nature of social media. There's also, for those who work in the neuroscientific field, there are also extensive research that cover how social media addiction is altering the brain chemistry, how it's affecting sleep. So if you speak to probably 1 in every 10 person you speak to now would have a sleep disorder, largely because it affects the blue light, also affects the eyes and how your brain chemistry works in general. It also builds a spike in dopamine. And so the focus usually is on getting more addictive content. And chances are that it reduces attention span as well. So you find out that people really cannot watch a 30-minute video. And you have to keep scrolling and scrolling. And so being in that addictive space of social media undermines that need for physical contact, need for physical interaction with others, and by extension undermines Afro-communitarian values. Okay. Also, the other way is the exploitation of data collection, the exploitation experienced through data collection, and this one touches slightly around the idea of colonialism, and colonialism on the grounds that data is collected from Africa. Unlike the EU, where there's an extensive data protection policy, many African countries are yet to sort of define even what an AI strategy would look like, or what sort of regulations around data protection, data policies. And usually the big tech companies know this, and so they use that opportunity to extract as much data as they can extract, which sort of mirrors what happened in colonialism in terms of extracting natural resources, but this time it's data. On the other side, there's I don't know if you're familiar with the story of crowdflower in Kenya, and Amazon Mechanical Turk. So what happens with those platforms is with Crowdflower hired lots of Kenyans to label data used to train self-driving cars. And of course, I don't have to explain, they paid ridiculous prices because it would be more expensive if they paid in the US per hour. So they're able to pay less and exploit the workforce without paying them competitive market prices for their labor, and have them sort of label the data, annotate the data, and also analyze some of the data used to train self-driving cars. And with platforms like this, that drives exploitation, or increases the chances of exploitation, which is also clearly what Afro-ethics and Afro-communitarian ethics actually stands against. Afro-communitarianism thinks that we flourish by other people flourishing at the same time. It's not exploitative. It's sort of like a symbiotic relationship. We interact with other people. The goal is not to exploit them. The goal is to become more human ourselves as they become more humans themselves. Okay, so let's look at unpacking the concept of dignity from an African perspective. One way we talk about dignity in from the African perspective is to look at it from the place of what is referred to as vitality or vital force. Vitality is thought of as that distinguishing quality that humans have that other species or life forms do not have. So what is it about a person being human that when they are born, they automatically have some inalienable rights to them? The idea is that they have a quality, even though it feels like it's not tangible, it's a quality that's special to them that would make us not compare a human, or at least we try not to compare a human to a dog. Somehow society just helps us. We just get to think that a human is ranked higher because they're human. And that quality, African ethicists believe that it's a vital force, that and it's usually expressed in things like consciousness, expressed in things like rationality, and some intelligence, creativity. That these versions or these attributes are things that make humans unique. They're the foundation of personhood. They're what separates us from other life forms. It's not to say other things like cats, dogs, animals in the wild do not have some form of vitality. They do, it's just not in the quantity and the quality that humans have it. And so Afro-ethicists believe that it's on the grounds that we have these attributes that we can have interaction with other people. That's why we can commune with other people. That's why we see it's some kind of enlightened self-interest. We know that we are better off if we interact with other people than if we are isolated. And it becomes the substructure upon which the idea of community and communalism is built. Also, dignity is it's a very crucial. In fact, it's a cornerstone of much of what we refer to as African thoughts on human rights. Of course, it's almost the same everywhere in the world, like even in the West. Dignity is a key part of it. But in relation to AI ethics, the goal is to put dignity, pursuing human dignity and respecting human dignity at the center of the conversation, and not just as an afterthought to say, to respect the person's dignity, then would seek some sort of consent to do that. It's supposed to be the default position before we arrive at making any sort of decision or making any attempt to build an AI system. Also, one of the ways the concept of dignity is slightly different in African ethics as compared to, say, Kant's notion of rationality is, whereas Kant's notion is focused on for a person to become, for us to speak about personhood within the Kant's framework, the idea is the person has to be rational, or the person has to act outside, like any compulsion from like an external force. It's not the same for African ethics. The focus here is on the ability to commune with other people. So one of those snags I know Kantians always run into is that we ask questions. Okay, so what happens to a person who is an imbecile, for instance, a person who has lacked the capacity to be rational, or a person who is schizophrenic or something? Do they lose their dignity because they do not have that? And that's usually, we try to come up with arguments as Kantians to say, oh, no, that's not the case, but all that. African ethics actually escapes that argument, because the goal is not only to be the object of community, of being able to commune with something, it's also being the subject of it. So we're not expecting a child to really know how to commune with society, but yet we attribute dignity to the child because we understand that it's in the process of becoming, in the sense of which we speak of personhood in African ethics. Some of the threats to dignity as we know them. One is, I give an example with facial recognition. So how facial recognition works? How many persons here are probably doing machine learning, or you're an ML engineer? Okay. Oh, of course.
So I'm not an ML engineer, but I like into it, so I'm... Okay.
Oh, great. So the way facial recognition works is basically we look at facial features, and we kind of number just think about it in simple terms. We number facial features, and it's just data points, where the eyes, the measurements of the eyes, like the colors and all that, the hair, the texture, and all that plays into how we do facial recognition. One of the things that, and if you've had the opportunity to work very closely with machine learning engineers or with data scientists, one of the thing you will notice is it's purely abstract and purely mathematical when the conversation is going on. No one is really thinking about the impact it has on people. No one bothers to think about that. We're just thinking about, why are we mismatching faces? And then we go back to the maths. And so the idea is, if we focus a lot more on the data points and the kind of data we're getting, the data we need to train a model, the focus is not really on the people behind that data. Okay, so we have cases where people have been misclassified by facial recognition. It's particularly a big problem for people of color and also women. And for this reason, there's a need to sort of view it, have a holistic view on what if we use facial recognition, how should we use it? And if we use it in the right way, which is like viewing people with a sense of dignity, first of all, to say, we're not just making this about data points and trying to get the facial features and number them. We're also looking at the people behind this the people behind these data points. And then that becomes like a crucial part to how we approach, say, labeling of data, and not just labeling of data. It helps us to sort of have the foresight to prepare for things like misclassification, which we see. One of the reasons why we have a lot of misclassification, especially for people of color, is that much of the initial data used to train many of the open source facial recognition models were actually done in the West. So it was labeled, not necessarily for the context in which many of them are being used right now. Okay, also AI tools sort of treat people as means to an end. So the data we can get from you are the means, and then we don't really think about you, as a person. We just say, if you've worked in a tech company before and you're referring to the data that's been extracted, it's just anonymized data of users. No one really, or aggregated data of users. Nobody really thinks about, it could be this person could be a student somewhere at Bonn, No one thinks about that. It's just like, oh, we've got a bunch of data. We're going to use that. We're going to train a model. And some models require some kind of data that, like, very private to people. So data like, say, if you're using social media, if you wondered why, of course you have, but thinking about you having a conversation with someone, and a few minutes later you're checking social media, and then there's an advert popping up following your conversation, or you see video suggestions following your conversation. The reason is that they need that kind of data to be able to sort of like improve the recommendation that for adverts, and that's the way they generate money from those platforms. And because that is done, the person using those tools are not thought of. The engineers do not think of that person as a person. It's they strip the idea of dignity from that person, and it's just like, oh yeah, this is a data point, or this is somewhere we can extract data from this person. And so it's important to see how dignity is sort of like at risk, simply because technology companies are not prioritizing human dignity when they try to extract data from people. Also, there's a lack of consent and bias. We're beginning to become more efficient with data policies and data governance, and how data provenance is doing, also giving people the right to be forgotten. So you could tell Google, for instance, that I don't want you to have access to my data beyond a certain point. So after 3 months, they delete all your data from their platform. You can also choose to be anonymous on Google and have all your personal data pulled off of Google or other platforms as well. But that is coming off lots of pressure from the world, and particularly the EU with its GDPR, insisting that you have to give people not just consent but informed consent. It has to be very clear what data you're collecting, how you use the data, and also concepts like data localization. Where should the data be used? What kind of data should you process outside the country? It's also like an important part of it, because when you do not do that, you actually put the person's dignity at risk. Okay, quickly, I'll just talk about digital colonialism. I'd mentioned earlier how AI development follows the path of colonialism, and in terms of digital exploitation, how much data is collected. We had Google invest close to about $1 billion to put fiber optic cable through West Africa. And if they're going to be offering that, of course, the saying that if you are not paying for a product, then you are the product. So the idea is to be able to get as much data as they can get and use that to better have improved services across Africa. There's also the Western values being imposed on this product or these tools, AI tools. And I'll show you how that is being counteracted by the pursuit of democratizing artificial intelligence knowledge, especially the technical knowledge. So if you think about what OpenAI is doing, for instance, some of the best minds in the world work for OpenAI. Some of the best researchers work for Google and are leading in the frontiers of this. Demis Hassabis, I think Demis Hassabis leads Google DeepMind, and they recently built a model that was able to deconstruct a probably like 100-year-old problem they've been trying to solve in cell biology, and they're able to get the substructures and the images of the structures of over 200 million proteins. Very, very massive, on a massive scale. And the good thing they did, which I commend them heavily for, is that they made that open source so that researchers in the pharmaceutical industry, medical researchers can have access to it. Bioengineering researchers can also have access to that, and also build, drugs, or build sort of like therapy or training protocols to help us fight some infections. And it's quite interesting that if you think about the kind of people who do this, there's a huge brain drain. So some of the best minds in Africa that contribute to building AI tools go work for these companies. And when we're building solutions, we're not building solutions for Africa. We're not building solutions for the majority of the world. The focus is we're building solutions for people who pay for it. And they pay the highest. They have the most funding for it. And so it puts, in a way, it's sort of like digital colonialism, where the best minds get to go, brain drain, but not just extracting of the best mind, but also extracting of data in that sense. Also, we talk about bias of data sets, and I mentioned the unethical labor practices while paying very little to people who label data. But also the bias in the data set. One of the reasons we have always had bias in data set is that data is not without context. Okay, so there's always a context around the data. So if you take it out of that context, you're definitely going to have some strings of biases across. That could be even things like natural language processing. I'll talk briefly about how that affects things like how languages are understood. So if you type, I don't know if you've tried to type things on Google Translate in German and see the English version, which is slightly different from what you had in mind, or you've done the reverse. How many persons have had that experience with other languages? Okay, yeah, so that happened. That's quite common because language is used within a context, and when you train a model to be able to do like a natural language processing, especially translation, the challenge is that people without sufficient knowledge of that language can actually take complete material on this and train a model, and still the model will not provide the context in which that language is being used. And so that becomes evident with bias in the data set. Okay? I'll try to skip this because we've talked about it slightly, or I've talked about it slightly before. So whereas the focus of utilitarianism is sort of like maximizing utility, and this could come in getting the most pleasure or getting the most value out of a thing, whereas Afro-communitarianism or African ethics, the focus is on, rather than getting the most out of it, it's like we focus on things like the common good. While utilitarianism focuses on the greater good, we focus on the common good. The common good, so how is your benefit to everybody? Whereas Kant focuses on rational agency and autonomy, the focus is on interdependence and community on the other hand. Okay. So I just want to talk briefly on principles for Afro-ethical AI frameworks. One of them is in building AI models, we want to center community relationships and human dignity. That's the primary focus. We want to make sure that whatever model we're building is starting from that point. How do we respect people's dignity? How do we center the community in it? Because the goal is not exploitation. The goal is actually communal flourishing. Also, the contextual awareness of cultural realities. This is one of the biggest one. Singapore recently invested, I think, about $45 million to build its own LLM for Southeast Asia, because it felt that they were largely underrepresented in how the data used for some of the open source LLMs have been used. So that's going to be reflected in not just the social context in which things are used and said, but the data also used to train this is more reflective of the people that will be using, the AI tool. If like with Open AI, for instance, even with Azure Cognitive Services or even with Google Gemini, there's still like a large gap around social context. But Google is still having a good time because they have access to all the Google searches and the materials are on Google's platform. So they're able to scrape through that data and give you a more accurate representation of what's happening in other countries. Like if you search for something in the Philippines for what's happening in the Philippines right now, you might get kind of misleading information from Open AI's platform or even Google's platform. And that's usually what we refer to as AI hallucination. And then when you say, oh, but this is wrong, this is what it's the correct answer, then it apologizes to you, oh, I'm sorry. And it sounds like it really doesn't know what it's doing. So it's important that social cultural context are actually taken into consideration. Also, we want to make it human-centered and inclusive as much as possible. We want to focus on people as the center of it and not necessarily how much data we can take. So what are the call to actions? One is the urgency to develop an African AI framework at the Global Center for AI. What we are doing is to ensure that African voices are heard with lots of collaborations with industry and governments to be able to help drive AI strategy across countries. And also you want to protect African values amid AI proliferation. And there are two projects I would mention at the end of this slide that they're doing great work trying to preserve those values. And the other is to broadly engage with stakeholders. So if you're building an AI tool within a company, you want to engage with the stakeholders, both internal and external stakeholders, and people who will be affected by the use of that service. This is one of the companies doing a lot of work based in South Africa. Lelapa is doing some work in natural language processing, and the goal is to try as much as possible to better represent African languages or under-resourced languages, particularly in Africa. It started with a few languages in South Africa to do that, and the goal is to try to see as much as possible to ensure we get the perfect translation when we need to do that. And they're building chatbots. South Africa has 15 official languages, which I think it's 15. Yeah, 15 official languages or thereabout. Is it 15? 11 official languages. Yeah, 11 official languages. So that it helps that people are able to have a chat with a chatbot in a different language, and it's giving them the right answer rather than using, say, telecoms platform, which gives you a completely different translation for local context. The other is the Hausa NLP project. So Hausa is one of the, I think it's the second largest spoken language in Africa. And the NLP project there, because it's also considered an under-resourced language, there's not so much materials on it that you could use to train a model. And so it's also what this team has been doing with the help from Google. They've been going back to look at digitizing some of the scholarly works that were written in Hausa way back before colonialism, and trying to see how they can digitize them and use that to train models that will do language translation. And this way, they're able to better contextualize the language. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Samuel, for kicking off our workshop and your valuable insights on the topic. We're going to now take some questions. We have, let's say, 10 minutes left and keep the coffee break a bit shorter today in the morning. The microphones, when you get them, they don't produce a sound. You don't have to tap on them. They're just for recordings only. Yeah, the floor is open for questions.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. It was very interesting. So I was just curious about one thing. In the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned Africa being not homogeneous, and then you talked about the Anglophone and Francophone ethical divisions. So there I was wondering, is there, or if there is not, then shouldn't there be another division from an African indigenous language group for the AI ethics and values? Because for me, or I think there's also lots of research that talk about the impact of language on the ethics and values that you hold. And while we're talking about ethics and values, indigenous ethics and values, I'm just thinking how useful it would be then to think about them from European imposed languages in bringing out the indigenousness. So I was just thinking if there's like already a division or thinking like that along those lines. Thanks.
Okay, do I answer immediately?
Yeah, you can answer, and then we'll answer immediately, and then one question after the other.
Sure. So when I said that, I was just trying to put a scope around the source materials I used for my work. And the idea is that, so Africa mostly is, people divide Africa into three. So like the Anglophone speaking, the Francophone speaking, and the, the North Africa, which is the mostly influenced by South or Middle East culture. And the idea is to, I was just basically citing works that have been done from English-speaking Africans. I mean, I speak English, so I mean, those are the documented works. What they try to do in some of the cases, they did something called ethnophilosophy. So they actually got the local languages and tried as much as possible to try to represent them in English. It doesn't mean it's a perfect translation, but I mean, those are the source materials we have. Yeah.
Okay, then the next question's over here.
Hello. Thanks, Samuel. I've been trying to meet Samuel for the last 5 years in person and have coffee, so today is the day. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question, and it's a question that I've been struggling with personally a lot, so I think I can't figure it out, so I'm going to pass it over to you. But I'm struggling with how do we access or assess like which African values to focus on. And there's a couple of reasons for that. You spoke about AI introducing non-African values, but I mean, this has been going on for a long time, right? The Christian missionaries, colonialism, it's already kind of difficult to assess what are like, I don't want to say pure African values, but what are the core African values, right? So how do you access that? So for me, I thought, okay, let's turn to Mets and let's turn to the academics. But then, people like Prof. Matulino would criticize that and say, but this is an elitist project. We don't know what people in community using the technologies are actually seeing as the central values. And also we know these values are being disrupted. You mentioned privacy. We know that something like privacy was maybe more underrepresented, and with AI it's becoming more central. So I'm struggling to figure out how do we, like, it also feels like there's this project of like returning to certain values, and even as we are returning to these values, they're kind of going missing because of this influx of Western values, right? So how do we get to these specifically African values that people have in mind when they are using technologies, do you think?
So the last time I spoke with Matulino on this subject, I know Matulino's position, but the initial groundwork, which much of the African ethics as we know it today were built on, were actually ethnographic studies and pure ethnophilosophy. I think it's Oruka that did a work on Sage philosophy, where he actually engaged with people, because much of African tradition used to be oral tradition, so you pass the knowledge through speaking to people about it in stories and folklores and all. So they still retain those values. I think there's also a consensus amongst African ethicists that the most common and prevailing, or even the most enduring ethical value that they can see is actually communitarianism, as it's built in unique sense in Africa. There are certain things that if Africans, they just understand it. They don't even have to come from the same country. They know exactly what it means.
Are you engaging with local communities at all?
Yes, especially like one of the examples I cited, the Hausa NLP projects. That's what one of the major things they've been doing. They've been because the sort of like the warehouse of knowledge about the Hausa people in Nigeria, for instance, because we've got Hausa-speaking people in Chad, they've got them in Ghana as well. The warehouse for that in Nigeria is the Sultanate. So there's the Sultan, and he's got like libraries that were written like with materials still in scrolls and all that. So they're trying to get that and try to digitize those materials so they can preserve them as well. So stuff like that, accessing, and that's one of the things the Lelapi AI project is doing, speaking with locals, like going back, like if you're trying to translate, say, Xhosa, for instance, they go back to Eastern Cape to speak to the people in the Eastern Cape. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take one more question over there. Yes. And then we'll see maybe one, please keep it short, and then we have one question afterwards, and then you have to pick Samuel in the coffee break or in the lunch break and keep talking to him.
Okay, I think just to continue in the same line with my predecessor, I think it's the thing we strike on my mind when you also introduce your division with regard to Anglophone and Francophone. Because even in Nigeria, you spoke about the Hausa. You have the Hausa in Chad, you have the Hausa in Cameroon.
Yeah.
In Nigeria, they speak English. In Cameroon, they speak French. So what is the difference? But at the end, they have the common value, which are connected to Hausas, to Sultanate. And so I can take the example in my tribes in Cameroon. So we have Muslim, which are Muslim, and we are Francophone. So I think I don't really see. So let's say categorizing that according to language is already for me a mistake, because I would rather go from the perspective of the indigenous knowledge and the tribes and try to divide and see now how the values are shared, not necessarily because of the language, because from this angle, definitely the things are already wrong from my point of view.
Let me just correct that impression. I guess I wasn't clear in communicating that, but I wasn't categorizing them based on language. I'm saying the materials I used for this talk were English-speaking authors focused in West Africa and East and Southern Africa. So those are the materials I used. So I didn't explore the Francophone-speaking authors who have written about African ethics. I'm not looking at it from that perspective. And I do agree with you. Artificial borders also had a big impact on culture and values in Africa. You talked about the houses in the Adamawa region of Cameroon. They're also in the Adamawa region of Nigeria. In fact, it's a big thing where the previous president of Nigeria said, like, I have cousins across the border. I literally walks to his cousin's house, and it's in another country, and they don't see it as another country. It's like, yeah, we're still the same people. And so I understand how borders, borders actually affect how we perceive values, but still, it's one connected and it's one connected system of value in the sense that I spoke about it. That these are salient values that are found there. It doesn't mean that everyone thinks about it the same, because the houses in Ghana are slightly different in culture from the houses in Nigeria. But I'm just saying these are salient values you can find in these places.
So one very quick question.
Yeah, thank you very much for exceptional talk, and it resonates very well with me because of my own background of coming from India. And my question is on how the African values or African ethics in AI are going to resist the celebrating individualism in the corporate or entrepreneurial culture, right? So, which is very much prevalent in the global South and the majority world, where you develop startups which are basically, if you go a bit earlier, this culture of superstar entrepreneur is absent. But today, it's very much prevalent in most of the majority world. Which is importing from the Silicon Valley, valuations and the billionaires and, whatnot. So how do we resist this culture, or from the ethical perspective? Because that is, in my view, it's again central to a lot of problems in ethical values, it's like, because celebrating wealth is becoming, more and more prevalent, then ethics takes a backseat.
Yeah.
So how do we resist this, this culture basically? So that's my question. Thank you.
Okay. The simple answer would be like it's probably something we would struggle with, but I'm very well aware that one of the ways to do that in places like Africa, and you cited India, is to solve a problem. Many of the problems we face. I don't think they really require a celebrity face to it. Like in the US, if you build a startup and it goes global, or you make billions out of it, you can talk about it so much and celebrate it. On the other hand, like, there's unique problems to Africa and to India and to many of the majority world that needs to be solved by focusing on the problem you're trying to solve, rather than sort of like an outcome of becoming a billionaire, because it's almost not feasible at that scale, which you get because you don't get the same kind of funding you get in Silicon Valley. By just focusing on the problem and sort of like impact you're making by solving that problem, I think it decenters the individual and focuses more on the community and how you're solving the problems for the community. Yeah.
Thank you, Samuel. So now we have 10 minutes for a coffee break. Please be back here at 11. Don't bring any drinks or food inside. It's a library. It would be very appreciated if you could keep them outside. And I saw 2 more questions. Grab Samuel by the side and hit him up outside, and then see you at 11 again.